Good evening. My name is Callie Brooks, and I'm proud to be a member of NCPR and serve on its executive council. I'm also the CEO of Adirondack Foundation, one of your local community foundations. Like the Adirondack guides who know where the best fishing holes and summit views are, Adirondack Foundation serves as a guide for local philanthropy. We track trends, identify promising approaches, vet ideas, and make connections to ensure the Adirondacks are a better place for all, forever. We are thrilled to help support this evening's program because local news and information are key to vibrant and healthy communities. As a growing number of Americans feel dispirited about how quickly unverified stories can spread through countless platforms without being fact-checked, we count ourselves lucky in the Adirondacks and the North Country region, where we have a healthy ecosystem of local news and information. We still have 3 daily newspapers, numerous weeklies, locally owned radio stations and magazines, 2 strong PBS stations, and of course, North Country Public Radio. All of these add to our civil discourse and give us confidence in journalism as a critical component to our democracy. We are especially lucky to have NCPR's coverage of local, state, and national news, especially during these unprecedented election season. On just a personal note, I never miss watching Tamara Keith and Amy Walter on Politics Monday. Just ask my 14-year-old. This is a fangirl moment for me, and I'm really happy to be here sharing it with all of you this evening. And I'm thrilled to turn it over to Mitch Teich and Tamara Keith for what I'm sure will be a lively and informative discussion. Thanks again for joining us tonight.
Well, thank you so much to Callie Brooks and the Adirondack Foundation, not just for the introduction and for sponsoring tonight's event, but for all the support they've provided to North Country Public Radio and the region over the years, from providing grant funding for our Piecing It Together series in the past to supporting many of the organizations we have reported on who are working to make the North Country a better place. As Callie mentioned, I'm Mitch Teich. I'm the station manager at NCPR. I'm delighted that so many people could join us this evening and that we were able to make this event free for all of our attendees. I will remind you, though, that we are a listener-supported public media organization, and so if you value and enjoy tonight's program and everything else we do, please consider making a contribution in support of North Country Public Radio. In doing so, you'll be making more events like this possible and also making it possible to keep bringing you the important, potentially life-saving news from across the North Country. You'll also make it possible for us to bring you news from NPR, including the very remarkable journalist who has joined us tonight. If you haven't had a chance to listen to David Summerstein's terrific interview with Tamara Keith that aired on the 8 o'clock hour last week, I encourage you to give it a listen when we are done tonight. But a short primer here. Tamara Keith has covered the White House for NPR since 2014, which means she has covered the last 2 years of the Obama presidency, plus the entire Trump presidency thus far. She's been with the network since 2009, working first as a business reporter, then a congressional correspondent before making the trip up Pennsylvania Avenue. And like so many of the experienced voices on NPR, Tamara Keith got her start at NPR member stations, including WOSU in Columbus and KQED and KPCC in California. And if you were watching PBS a little while ago, you'll know that she's also a regular guest on the News Hour. Tamara Keith, welcome to the virtual North Country. I hope the traffic wasn't too bad getting up here tonight.
Well, you know, I had to walk all the way upstairs to my home office, but yes.
Before we get too far into the conversation, I do want to mention that we've already had many questions submitted by people joining us this evening, so we'll start getting to those relatively quickly. And as we talk, if those of you in our audience have questions, you can use the Q&A button down towards the bottom of your screen, and those questions will find their way to me, and we'll get to as many of those questions as we can. But I want to get the conversation underway here. We're a few days removed from the Republican National Convention, which, given the current way of the world, was probably fated to be unlike any RNC that came before it. But it was really unlike any other convention. With a weekend having passed, can you look back and reflect on the RNC that you experienced?
Yeah, so I actually was credentialed to cover Thursday night President Trump's speech from the White House South Lawn. And as someone who has been living in this pandemic and also covering events, it was an experience. I have not been around that many people in a long time. Yeah, there were, according to the campaign, about 1,500 people in attendance. Almost none of them were wearing masks. There were very few masks to be seen. The seating was not socially distanced. The chairs were right next to each other. And in some ways it was just a little bit jarring because we're so accustomed now to keeping our space from people and everyone wearing masks, or many people wearing masks, certainly. And the other thing that was, remarkable about it was that this was a political event on the South Lawn of the White House. There was a really nice set built on the South Lawn of the People's House. And even in the speech, President Trump said something to the effect of, "And I'm here and you're not." And here is, public land. And there were these big jumbotrons set up. There were all the American flags. And then when it was all over, there were fireworks shot off over the National Mall, including, and I'm really sad that there was some shrubbery that was obscuring my view, and I was on the radio, so I couldn't walk away from my microphone to get to actually see all the fireworks. So I did not see in real life the Trump 2020 blast up into the sky. But I got to see like the lower fireworks while trying to shout over them to Ari Shapiro with a bad connection.
Well, given the fact that this took place on public land, do you think are we likely to hear more about the Hatch Act in the days to come, the rules against using public office for political gain, or is it likely to kind of go back under the radar as the campaign heats up?
Well, and just today in the White House press briefing room, President Trump came out and gave a briefing. Ostensibly, it was supposed to be about coronavirus. He talked about coronavirus for like 30 seconds. Then he went on a very long rant about Joe Biden, about leftist protesters, as he put it, anarchists, spoke for a very long time in explicitly political terms. This was not, a presidential address to the nation from the briefing room. He took a few questions, not very many, and then he bailed out of there. There's no way to interpret what happened tonight in the briefing room other than that was another campaign event. The Hatch Act. It's a thing. It is a thing that is meant to prevent the very things that have been happening, which is this blurring of the politics and the personal, the state and the person who is president. Now, it doesn't sort of technically apply to the president. He's not supposed to order people to break the Hatch Act, but a lot of things don't technically apply to the president or technically apply to Congress. The electeds have a lot of leeway on these things. And the reality is that if a White House staffer, for instance, there have been a couple of times when there's been a finding that Kellyanne Conway violated the Hatch Act, for instance, who top counselor to the president who's leaving the administration. There was no punishment. Because do you know who under the Hatch Act is the arbiter of what the punishment should be for a violation? The head of that agency. So who's the head of the agency that is the White House? The President of the United States. And it's good for him. All of these Hatch Act violations or potential Hatch Act violations work to his benefit. So he's not going to crack down.
Something of a loophole in the Hatch Act there.
Well, there are so many things, and we talk about this a lot on the NPR Politics podcast and elsewhere, but and on the NewsHour and everywhere else that I go these days. But there are so many things that are norms, but not laws. There are so many things that are not enshrined in law, but every president since Nixon has released their tax returns. There isn't a law that says they have to do it, but they've all done it. President Trump didn't do it. And there's just countless examples of norms that have just completely been busted. But this blurring of the political and the personal and the political and the official, it's indistinguishable at this point. Like official White House events play the Trump campaign soundtrack as he walks on and walks off the stage.
You're talking about the presidential briefing. The relationship we see represented between this president and the media is, I think, fraught is maybe a good word to describe it. But is there another side to the media's interaction with the White House that we don't see, that you're privy to, that is a more collegial day-to-day kind of existence?
It's a very fraught relationship. And certainly at times it is collegial. At times, like, we all have a job to do. We need to know where he's going to be. They need to tell us where he's going to be so that we can be there so they can get the coverage they want. So there is something of a working relationship. It's not completely toxic behind the scenes. In some ways that doesn't really matter, though. What matters is what the public sees, and is, if the president is calling the press the enemy of the people, that certainly can erode faith in what has been a very important institution in our democracy. That, like, there are consequences globally to the toxicity and the way the president talks about the media, and certainly there are also times where members of the press have seemingly been radicalized or have chosen combat, and it helps feed the perception of us as the opposition party, which most of us don't wake up every day and say, gosh, how can we fight the president? We wake up every day saying, let's expose the truth. Let's tell the public what's going on. Let's ask questions. Instead, every member of the American public can't be there in that briefing room. And right now only 14 reporters can. So we take our responsibility to ask questions very seriously.
We're into the last 2 months before the general election, and as we're having this conversation, both the president and Joe Biden, the Democratic nominee, are planning more in-person campaign events than they have had in recent months. How dependent do you think these campaigns are on these in-person events? How much are they for the people who attend, but how much are they for the optics of having an audience?
Yeah, and let me just say that I don't think at this point there's any indication that Biden is going to do events with a general public audience. At this point, his events have all been pool only, which means that 13 or 14 journalists are allowed in the room. It's a very limited group. There for Biden events, they like draw circles on the ground so that people get the right social distance in the room, and that is both out of public health concern and not wanting to be responsible for spreading coronavirus. It's also a choice. It's a visual choice. It is a deliberate effort to say, we are taking the coronavirus seriously. Why aren't they? And in much the same way, President Trump having in-person events. Now, no more big indoor arenas. They're outdoors, or they're in aircraft hangars. Which are partially indoors, partially outdoors. The president doing big events where people aren't wearing masks, that is also a choice. It's a choice for aesthetics. It's a choice because he feeds off the crowd and he needs the crowd. But it's also to project an image, like on the South Lawn, to project an image that everything's cool, man. Coronavirus is a thing. It's in the past tense. There were people at the RNC that were talking about coronavirus in the past tense. And in a lot of ways, the president and the White House response has moved on. They're obviously, it's still a major thing, but they've moved on to the recovery, the rebuilding, the get the economy going. They've moved past the let's fret about the virus phase.
we've had a lot of questions that our audience members have asked already, and a couple of them speak directly to the conversation we've been having already. And so I want to get to some of those questions. We have an audience member named Fred Stein. He wants to know, what are the challenges in covering the president in his official capacity and while he's running for president? If it's a gray area for him and the country, is it a gray area for you as a reporter?
Well, NPR doesn't carry his briefings live, and most of the TV networks aren't now either. So there isn't an issue of thinking that you're carrying an important address to the nation live, and then all of a sudden realizing in the middle of it, oh no, this is really just like a campaign rally in disguise, because we aren't airing those things live. So
that happened earlier. That happened a few months ago. I think certainly as the coronavirus pandemic began, there were some of those events. Yeah,
no, there were some. At first, when the pandemic was really just a new thing, and there was a valuable public health information coming out of the briefings, and they weren't these sort of freewheeling affairs. Initially, we did start airing them, and then we people way higher up than me determined that our audience was missing all things considered, where we were reporting important context that was necessary for people making decisions about their lives. And so we went back to not airing the briefings in whole, and the briefings were getting longer and longer and longer also. So I think that it doesn't really affect us that much. If the president says something newsworthy, whether it's at a campaign rally or an official event that seems oddly like a campaign rally, we would still cover it in the same way.
We had a question following up on our conversation about the Hatch Act from Susan Novak, a professor of journalism and law at SUNY Potsdam. Wants to know, do you anticipate that the next administration after Trump might try to close the loopholes in the Hatch Act that the administration, as she says, has dynamited open?
So I think that, I don't really know, but I will say that history would tell us that if there is a norm-breaking presidency, that there historically has been backlash to that has led to congressional elections where people who are promising change or promising to clean things up or to enforce norms as laws, where those members of Congress are elected, they come in with a mandate that they feel to sort of close some of these loopholes and fix some of these, enshrine some of this stuff into law. And we have many examples in not so distant history of Congress sort of a backlash to a president that had an overly broad view of presidential power, and Congress saying, oh, let us take some of that power back. We did not mean to cede that much power to the presidency.
Chris sent several questions in ahead of time via email, and one of them goes back to a question, and we were talking about how you had, I guess it was in your introduction, I mentioned that you had covered the Obama administration before the Trump administration. And he wants to know, who has been your favorite press secretary to work with and why?
So I've worked with several. I did not get to know Jay Carney very well. And I've worked fairly well with all of the Trump press secretaries, though Stephanie Grisham was sort of invisible, both as a reporter trying to get stuff out of the White House. And anyway, Josh Earnest, who was like not the most exciting press secretary. His briefings were not like scintillating stuff. He was President Obama's final press secretary. He often delivered dad jokes from the podium. He came very well prepared, and he did his best to answer our questions, even about policy, or especially about policy. And he was the kind of press secretary that you'd want to introduce your mom to, because he'd say something like totally not true, but that would make your mom really proud. So I'm going to go with Josh.
And in a related question, we have a question from Gretchen, who wants to know, what is the single greatest change in your work as a reporter from the Obama administration to this administration?
Oh, well, I never woke up to Obama tweets that caused my day to be completely upended. That's been a big change. And also, President Obama, when President Trump came to visit the White House, when President Obama, during the transition, President Obama was heard on a hot mic saying, when reporters shout questions at you, you just ignore them and they'll go away. And I don't know if it was a reaction to that, a visceral reaction to completely ignore all advice from his predecessor, but every time reporters shout questions, almost every time President Trump answers them. And so what that means is that he's like constantly making news, or not, and sometimes it isn't news, but he's like constantly creating content. Like, I am certain that the next president, no matter who it is, once President Trump is no longer president, if it's Biden, if it's, 4 years from now, whoever that is, they're not going to talk as much. And so in some ways, like, it's been this, as a reporter, you often wouldn't know what the president of the United States was thinking. And now you do.
All the time.
All the time. And we might miss that. We might miss knowing exactly what the president is thinking because he says the quiet parts out loud.
We had a couple of questions about bias or perceived bias. Rod wrote that he's no fan of President Trump, but he perceives an overly negative tone in interviews with administration officials, especially in interviews by Judy Woodruff on the NewsHour. And then another listener emailed to ask, quote, "I love NPR, but I find your coverage slanted on a consistent basis to the left of political center. Therefore, I would like to know if this is intentionally done." What about this perception of NPR as more aligned with left of center politics?
Well, and I can't speak for Judy. I absolutely
Sure.
can't speak for Judy. She speaks for herself quite well. What I will say is that for all the criticism of us being left-leaning, the criticism from people on the left saying they are deeply disappointed in us is sometimes even louder. And I don't necessarily subscribe to the view that, if everybody's mad at you, you're doing your job right. But certainly it is the case that, people on the left are often frustrated with our interviews and our coverage, and people on the right think we're a bunch of leftists, and really, like, I approach my job every day wanting to be fair, absolutely wanting to be fair, to do fair coverage, but not to conceal facts in an effort to be fair.
We also did have a question from an audience member named Fred, who says, "Why do you think it is that more voices further out on the left of the political spectrum are not heard or interviewed more frequently on NPR, including in its news coverage? People such as Noam Chomsky, Chris Hedges, Angela Davis, and others." He would submit that voices on the corresponding end of the right part of the spectrum, people like Bill Kristol, Richard Lowry, Jonah Goldberg, Ari Fleischer, et cetera, are heard and interviewed more frequently than those on the left. And I guess the question I would follow up with is, what insight can you give us into how NPR news magazines, and I realize that you are a correspondent, but how the news magazines choose the pundits that they do to be heard from?
I wish I knew the answer to that, because I don't always agree with their choices either. But I try to just do my own job. I'm sorry for not having a more satisfying answer. I will say that in terms of the people that I interview, we're working really hard. We're like tracking the diversity of the voices that we put on the air, because we feel that it's important that our people that we interview reflect a wide range of viewpoints, races, gender, but because I cover the Trump administration, frequently the people who are insiders are white Republican men. And so I find it to be a challenge at times to have diverse voices in my stories, a frustration, because I need to talk to people who know what the president is thinking, because they've talked to him. And he's not talking to Noam Chomsky.
Not that we know of.
Well, right, that we know of. But if he was, he'd probably be tweeting about it.
Can you, I mean, along those lines, can you give us some insight into what a day in the life of a White House correspondent is like, at least in a normal time when there's not a pandemic? I mean, how much time are you physically in the old executive office building or wherever they have the White House press corps housed?
Oh, yeah. So, this is not a normal time, let me tell you. Let me just go through right now, and then I'll go back and tell you about.
Right. I was hoping for a compare and contrast.
So right now, normally there are 49 seats in the briefing room. Right now, we are only allowing 14 people in per day. I say we because I'm on the board of the White House Correspondents Association, and I'm actively involved in this excruciating process of limiting access, as we are an organization that is supposed to be pushing for more access. And yet now we are limiting access because we don't want to be, we have had no cases of journalist to journalist transmission thus far, and that is a miracle, an absolute miracle that we know of. So right now the policy is if you're not in the briefing room, you don't come to the White House that day, which means the radio seat comes up every 11 days. And then there are 4 of us who cover the White House for NPR. So it's, like how I'm there like maybe once a month. It's just not very often. And when I am there, I go to the briefing, I'm pool when I'm there. So that would mean when I get in, I get a COVID test first thing. Because if there's any chance that you'll be in close proximity to the president, you get a COVID test. And then, we might get called into the Oval, or we might, if the president is doing an event, we'll get called to where he is to cover that in the East Room or whatever. Back in the before times, NPR had a seat in the briefing room every single day. I worked there, a quarter of the time in a rotation with my colleagues. And we actually, at the start of the Trump administration, because of the early morning tweets and the late night tweets and the late press conferences and all of that, we started a shift system. So you're either White House AM or White House PM. It doesn't always work. Let me just tell you. AM and PM blur together, and suddenly you're on Up First and All Things Considered in the same day, and you're like a zombie. And that's a pretty standard operating procedure, actually.
Well, and I guess along those lines, how much as a White House correspondent did you rely on the ability to kind of bump into people to be able to either have access to quotes or background or off the record conversations? And what do you do about that kind of thing now?
Yeah, well, and let me describe. So the press work area is like in it's where the swimming pool used to be in a previous administration, but then they covered up the swimming pool, and the briefing room is on top of where the swimming pool was, and the pool is still there. So you can go down and see the tile. And all the servers are down there now. But so the press work area is like basically attached. It's sort of like straddling the East Wing and the West Wing. And so we can walk up to what's called lower press and upper press, where the press secretary is, where, you can basically see the Oval Office as you're walking up if the door is open. It's just right there. So there's a lot of happenstance where you're like, what is so-and-so doing here? Or, you know, like back in when things were crazy, like on the day Michael Flynn got fired, like, you know, Reince Priebus came by and told us, and then was, an administration official came by and told us.
Should we not have known that?
I mean, I'm sure it's in somebody's book. Somebody's tell-all. But it, you know, like there was a fair bit of serendipity, and also they were like pretty bad at responding to emails in the press office. So like you just needed to drop in on people. You know, the Kaylee's operation, they're like better at responding to email, it seems like. It's not perfect. You know, like a month ago, I met a source outside of the Starbucks. I ordered on the app both of our coffees, and then we like elbow bumped and walked around the block a couple times drinking our coffee for our source meeting.
It certainly would be a different spin on All the President's Men, wouldn't it?
Yeah. But you know, a lot of people prefer to operate by phone anyway. You know, like Maggie Haberman is arguably the best White House correspondent in the whole press corps, and she comes to Washington like once every 2 months.
We have a question from Christina from Plattsburgh. And actually, we have a couple of related questions here. What do you believe is the role of journalists and reporters in calling out or pushing back on lies and misinformation expressed by political figures? Is there value in members of the press corps supporting one another by insisting that their fellow reporters' questions be answered in a truthful and respectful manner?
Yes. I have always been very proud of my fellow press corps colleagues when if somebody's question isn't being answered and the press secretary is clearly trying to move on, having the next person in line, if it's important and if the question is an important news of the day question, either deferring back and saying, I'd like to give my colleague more time, or asking their question again. But I think that those things need to be organic. And I don't think that, you know, sitting around and organizing all that does is create this, like, you know, vast reportorial conspiracy that just, it doesn't help anything. And the reality is that different organizations have different needs, and like Bloomberg News is going to ask about something that's going to move the markets. They're not going to ask about, you know, racial justice issues, or, you know, and you can't force your colleagues to ask a question that's not in line with their reporting needs. Like, people come to these briefings to get answers to questions for stories that they're working on. So it can be a challenge. But, you know, absolutely, when we can back each other up, we absolutely should.
Well, and along those lines, Eileen from Canton asks a similar question, but follows it up with this query. How do you think ordinary citizens could best confront erroneous statements we encounter in our interactions in the community?
Oh, and that the other thing, I didn't answer the first part of the last question, so thank you for bringing this up. You know, fact checking is an important part of what we do. It's best done in real time, but that's not always possible. Sometimes it can be really hard to keep up with all the erroneous things that are said. And the way I approach it is I try not to put things on the air that are completely untrue, unless that is of news value itself, in which case I do the fact sandwich, and I say that what is coming up is baseless, or whatever the language would be, and then follow it up with, in reality, blah, 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 blah. So we, you know, if something that is not true is going to be put on the air, we need to couch it. In terms of how to do this in real life, man, that's tough. Because there's been so much erosion in all of our institutions, and it's difficult for many people to accept sources of truth and fact. And so, you know, I would say that my own personal approach is, in my own personal interactions, is to do it in a non-confrontational way that nudges and tries to get facts into the bloodstream. But man, it can be tough. It can be really tough, especially when you're dealing with family or close friends, and there's a lot of really bad information out there.
It's like that scene in Annie Hall. You want your own version of Marshall McLuhan standing there when, you know, he's being misquoted, so that you can pull him out as a fact checker.
Yes.
I'm going to turn topics a little bit to a couple of people who had maybe more human interest questions, and a couple of people asked about this. One of them was Paul, who is in Canton, who says he's watching with his middle school daughter and wants to know what inspired you to become a reporter.
Oh, I like this question. You know, I was a backseat listener, probably like his daughter is too, which is to say, you know, in the back of the Subaru, we listened to a lot of public radio, whole lot of public radio, many different Subarus over the years.
Not that that's a stereotype or anything.
Not that I was raised a stereotype. But I mean, you know, like, I just got very, I enjoyed the storytelling. I enjoyed talking to my parents about the stories. And then, and I was already sort of headed in this direction, maybe a little bit. I mean, my parents pushed me in this direction, but made me think that I wasn't being pushed in the direction of journalism. I don't know. Maybe they made me think I had free will and license, but I didn't. I'm happy with their choice for my life. But when I was in 6th grade, I wrote an essay for like a "What do you want to be when you grow up" competition. And I said I wanted to be a volcanologist and study volcanoes, but mostly like I wanted to win a writing contest. And I was very interested in volcanoes, but whatever. I did win. And the prize, in addition to $700 or whatever it was that the local CBS affiliate would do a story about me. And I got to go to the TV station, and it was all over from there. I interned at that TV station a few years later. Well, more than a few, my senior year of high school.
The real question is, do you drop volcano facts in on your friends and colleagues?
You know, I have forgotten more than I now know. Like
A couple other human interest questions. One audience member would like to know what Judy Woodruff is like.
Judy Woodruff is awesome. I mean, Judy Woodruff is extremely sweet, super caring. And also, though, you know that she is an absolute badass. She doesn't like let on all the time, but she didn't get to where she is without being exceedingly tough and exceedingly talented.
This is a terrific question. I love this. Jim DeShays asks, how realistic was the television show The West Wing? And are you a CJ fan?
Okay, so CJ was great. I loved The West Wing. It is, it's fan fiction. It's not even close. I mean, Veep is probably closer, but you know, there's not a lot of high-minded speechifying going on. You know, like, West Wing is just it is some fiction.
The way we wish public discourse would take place. Exactly.
We all wish that we could deliver those monologues just in our everyday life, but and that only the best of intentions were guiding our leaders, but that's not exactly how it always works.
I want to turn back to some policy questions. We have a question that references the 21st Congressional District, which is where most of the North Country is located, has been identified as one with the highest percentage of ticket splitter voters who don't follow party lines. What kind of insight do you have into the polarization of the nation as it has changed since you became a reporter, first reporting on Congress and now the White House?
Is New York 21 Elise Stefanik's district?
It is indeed.
I think Elise Stefanik she is a story of exactly how the Republican Party has changed. It has been fascinating to watch her career because when she initially ran and won, she ran absolutely as a moderate, and as a Paul Ryan disciple, or that's not the right word, but an ally of Paul Ryan. And then Paul Ryan was run out of town on a rail. And she has shifted, certainly she still has moderate views on many things. She voted for the Postal Service bill most recently in the House. She has times where she separates slightly from the president, but she is most vocally a major defender of President Trump and has become a Trump ally who gets invited to the events where the Trump allies get invited, and she has really truly shifted to align herself with the president, which of course he's the president of the United States. He's the leader of the Republican Party. It's his party. But I think that arguably her politics are shifted to be more reflective of him. She had worked on the Romney campaign. And look at how far things have, she's not allied with Romney right now. And I think that is a reflection of a movement in our politics too, where there's really no reward in American politics in congressional races for being, a moderate Republican. There just isn't. There's a graveyard of moderate Republicans who thought that being moderate would get them through 2018, and guess what? It didn't. Separating yourself from President Trump doesn't work. Democrats aren't going to, give you a cookie because you separated yourself from the president. They're still going to vote for a Democrat because we're so polarized. And if you separate yourself from the president, Republicans may just not vote for you. So there's no reward in moderation at this point. And I think you could make the same argument in many Democratic congressional districts too. That was a much longer answer than you wanted.
No, I think it's a question that I think a lot of people in the North Country have, just because it is in a lot of ways a very independently thinking kind of place. Yeah. And I think the Elise Stefanik phenomenon is one that we're all interested in as well. Someone else asked a question. You've been covering the White House firsthand for, I guess it's 6 years now. At the same time, who are some of your best go-to sources for institutional memory or historic knowledge that you turn to?
I text David Beschloss sometimes. Michael. I'm so bad with names. Michael Beschloss. I know his name when I text him. It's in my phone. I'm the worst with men's names. Jim.
Yes, thank you.
I talked to my colleagues. Don Gagne has been around a really long time. Mara Liasson obviously has covered many a White House going back to the Clinton administration. C-SPAN is also a great source of my institutional knowledge. I go back to C-SPAN. The C-SPAN has the most amazing archives. I don't know if normal people get excited about the C-SPAN website, but I love it.
One of my proudest achievements is being in the C-SPAN archives. Just once, but...
I still haven't been on the C-SPAN morning show, which makes me very sad. However, one of my panels was picked up by C-SPAN, which was like highlight of my year in 2019.
Um, Speaking, I mean, you now have this 6 years of institutional memory yourself, and as you say, you're an officer with the White House Correspondents Association. So, what kind of mentorship do you provide to new reporters who come in and are a part of this, fairly exclusive cadre?
Yeah, I mean, we actually, through the White House Correspondents Association, have a mentorship program for young journalists who are scholarship recipients from our annual scholarships. So I mentor journalists through there, and then I do my best to help both the people who I work with directly and also other White House reporters. The funny thing is, we're obviously extremely competitive. But we're also extremely collegial. There's a certain element of we're all, and this predates the Trump administration. This definitely goes back to my time in the Obama administration too. But like, we're all in this foxhole together. And even though, we want to be the one that gets the scoop, we admire the one who does get the scoop. We're good to each other. And we need to be, because we truly are all in this very challenging beat together.
And it must be hard not to see these people kind of in person. I mean, the same thing that we're all experiencing, the people that we just sort of turn to for like human interaction.
Yeah. I mean, when I get to go to the White House, as much as I'm like wearing my N95 mask, I feel an uplift because I'm seeing my fellow journalists who I don't get to see except through screens now. And just like being there, I'm like floating on air. And then I go wash my hands. But it's certainly isolating and challenging, but I'm extremely lucky because I have a job that I can do mostly from my house, which is lucky.
Lori asks, will you comment on the president's tone and treatment of female reporters?
Yeah, he doesn't like us much. It's obvious. And he particularly seems to have difficulty with female reporters who are women of color, telling them that their question is nasty or that they're being rude or, I don't even know what to make of this still, but the last time I was in a briefing with the president, I asked about, he had signed this executive order on prescription drug prices. And he said, it's not going to go into effect for a month. And on Tuesday, all the drug company people are coming here because they want to make a deal. They don't want this executive order to go into effect. And so it was Tuesday and I was there at the White House and I was like, sir, you said that today you were having a meeting with drug company people and it was canceled. It didn't happen. What happened? And I think the right word for it is he started lying. Because he was like, oh no, that wasn't today, that's tomorrow. Well, the next day, Wednesday, he had an event in another state. So it definitely wasn't tomorrow. He was just like, oh gosh, I'm just going to scramble and say something. And then he said like, I can see you're really upset about it. And I don't know if he was being sarcastic or if he was like accusing me of being an emotional woman. But it was like, what's going on here? Like I had asked the question because I thought he would complain that the drug companies were standing him up and that they didn't care about, Americans paying exorbitant prices. And then he just it just went in a completely, it went somewhere I didn't predict.
And presumably he just didn't have an answer ready for you.
Yeah, he just didn't have an answer ready. So instead of saying that, or the meeting was canceled or they didn't RSVP or, whatever it was, he just started BSing.
We have one of Chris, who asked a series of questions, included this one. Have your views of the government and the executive branch in particular changed since you started working at the White House?
This is not going to be precisely the answer that Chris is fishing for, but I will say that I went from covering Congress to covering the White House. And, like the covering the White House is this highly coveted beat where, that is like the top job. Like, you've reached the pinnacle in journalism. I've reached my goal. I've made it. And then I got here and I was like, oh, this is not as much fun as I thought it might be, for a couple of reasons. One, it turns out it's really just like a general assignment reporting job that just happens to have extremely high stakes. But on any given day, you're just like thrown in a different direction, which can be super fun, but it doesn't allow the level of depth in policy reporting that I tend to enjoy. That said, obviously I'm enjoying my job. It's great. It's really tough. It's really, really tough. But the other thing that sort of surprised me was, covering Congress, you can walk down the hall and talk to any old member of Congress. They are there, and like the most dangerous place is between a member of Congress and a microphone. And like Mark Meadows, now the chief of staff. Mark Meadows and I used to talk all the time, just in the hallways. And now he's the chief of staff. And at the White House, the flow of information is very restricted. It's much more challenging. The environment is just so different. And so that was sort of a bit of a rude awakening coming from Congress.
But this isn't a question of Mr. or Mrs. Smith goes to Washington and, you had this whole idealistic idea of what the executive branch would be, and it was completely pulled out from under you.
No. I like to say that I'm skeptical, but not cynical. I like to say that.
We have just a few minutes left, and I wanted to ask you, as we said, a lot of people know you for your White House coverage. A lot of people know you because of your regular appearances on the NewsHour. But what do you get out of being a part of the NPR Politics podcast? What itch does that scratch that your sort of day-to-day work in the White House either doesn't, or what's your appetite to do on the podcast?
Well, I mean, on the podcast, I get to be a little bit more myself than I am on a morning edition, where I tend to be more serious. And so, I'm able to sort of let my personality out, such as it is. And that's fun. The other thing with Politics Podcast is, I'm there with my colleagues and we're just having a conversation about politics, and we get to just talk and jaw, and it's very enjoyable. And also the audience is so invested in us, and we're so invested in the audience. Like it's a much more personal relationship with the audience. Just as an example, I was out in Sacramento, California for an event about a year ago, when Cokie Roberts passed away. And I was just in a total funk. I was headed to go to the studio to tape a podcast, remembering Cokie, and I was devastated. And I stop at Starbucks to get a drink, and the woman at the Starbucks counter calls out my name to give me my beverage, and she's like, "Are you Tamara Keith from the Politics Podcast?" And she was a regular listener of the Politics Podcast, and she was like, "Oh, I'm so sad about Cokie. You must be so sad about Cokie." And I mean, it was just like in the middle of a place where I didn't know a lot of people, and I certainly didn't know the barista of the month. She was barista of the month for a reason. And it just brightened my day. And I assume that like meeting somebody from the podcast also brightened her day a little bit too.
You hope, anyway.
Yeah.
We had a question, and I guess I'm gonna maybe play junior psychologist a little with this question, but Ed asks if you ever feel like you don't belong there, and I don't know whether this is a question, you know, like imposter syndrome, whether like you wake up some mornings and like there's this strange juxtapositioning of yourself and the White House, or not.
So in answer to your question, of course I have imposter syndrome. I'm competing against the New York Times and the Washington Post and myself. And of course I have imposter syndrome. It's like natural. And I try to squish it. But the other thing is that, and this has nothing to do with who the president is at any given moment. But when you walk through those gates at the White House and you walk up to that gleaming white building, which if you don't get too close is really quite beautiful and in perfect shape. And if you get too close, you know that it's not in perfect shape and there's roaches. But there's a feeling of awe that this building where, you know, an important part of the American government has worked for, you know, many years, you know, that I get to go to work in this place. And, you know, it's not an unhealthy sense of awe, like, oh my gosh, but it is an honor to have the responsibility for NPR and for PBS NewsHour at times. It is an honor to have the responsibility of reporting on this institution of our government. It's an honor, it's a responsibility, it's overwhelming at times, and you just have to kind of like put your head down and do the work and know that every day is a new day and you can always be better the next day.
Well, and I'm hoping that was the spirit with which that question was asked. So, and it was certainly a good answer. And my gosh, we have had so many good questions and so many more than we can get to tonight. We're going to take one more question in just a moment. But first, an enormous thanks to you, Tamara Keith, for joining us this evening. Thanks also to the Adirondack Foundation and Callie Brooks, who's now joining us on the screen for just a second, so we can wave to her. And the Adirondack Foundation for sponsoring tonight's event, to St. Lawrence University's IT department for their technical support, and to NCPR's Jessica Lawrence for the many ways that she made tonight's show great. And thanks to all of you who joined us in the virtual audience and who continue to contribute in support of North Country Public Radio. And we do have one more question from an audience member. It is about aesthetics, and they would like to know, Tamara Keith, what do you think of the new White House Rose Garden?
Now, I will say that I currently have a pumpkin overtaking my back hill, large pumpkin vine. It is not attractive, and I apologize to the people who live across the street from me. So maybe you shouldn't trust my horticulture thoughts. However, I did get to see the new Rose Garden as I was on my way out to the South Lawn for the inaugural event. And I'm going to sort of withhold judgment on it. It is more ADA compliant, and that is an important thing. It's a little austere, or, you know, I'd like to see it in the spring. Any new plant hasn't really come into its own. You don't know how those rose blooms are really going to look when they're fully in. You don't know how that shrubbery is going to, I feel like I could say that it doesn't look that awesome right now, and then go there in April when the tulips are up and just be blown away.
There's a metaphor for the potential in all of us.
Yes.
And as an officer of the White House Correspondents Association, do you have pruning responsibilities?
Heck no. That would be a terrible mistake on the part of the government to put me in charge of anything related to do with plants.
Well, Tamara, Keith, it has been a delight to chat with you. Thank you so much for virtually coming and visiting us. We hope we'll see you sometime in person in the future. But really, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you for all the great questions. It was a lot of fun. Let's do it again in real life.
All right.